today, I suppose we're going to give a bit of an overview of the SMaRteN project that we're going to be running over the next year and a half. But I suppose one of the key things as well today, we just want to give a bit of a background to where we've actually come from in arriving at this point as well, because I think for us it's been a bit of a journey in terms of getting to this point, and hopefully it will continue for long to come. But I think just to give a sense to those of you who may be starting out on your journeys, for example, or just some of our reflections, I guess, along the way, and how we've actually come to a point of having the opportunity to now have a SMaRteN funded project. So we come from quite different schools here at the university. So myself, I'm a researcher in sport and exercise psychology. So my work revolves around concepts like flow, optimal experience, and the benefits of exercise kind of for mental health, and how we can actually get people to be more active, what strategies we might actually use for that. And I suppose your background, Kelly, do you want to give a brief snippet of your background, because we obviously come from different spaces on this?
So my subject background is public health. So I'm interested in mental health from a preventative aspect, about how we can change the environment to improve the conditions rather than treating individuals. And a lot of the work that I do now is, as it says there, Lincoln Academy of Learning and Teaching. I work predominantly now with academic staff, helping them to develop their teaching practice.
So we come from quite distinct backgrounds. So I think it's probably important to kind of get you to know how we came to have this collaboration, because we're in different schools and so on. So we're going to explain our journey, where we've come from to get to this point. We'll share some of the findings from the study that actually gave us a platform to be able to move into a position to apply for a SMaRteN fund, and just give you a bit of an overview of the project that we're intending to run over the next 16, 17 months. So how did we meet? We met at a mental health first aid training course for higher education. And it was one of those kind of early icebreaker activities where we had to kind of say who we were and what our interests were, why we were here. And at that meeting, I guess that's where the both of us pretty much said the same thing. And one thing led to another once we had the coffee break, and pretty much that's where it spiraled from. We graduated 10 years apart, and I think in terms of sharing our PhD experiences, one thing that really was clear in our stories is that nothing seemed to have changed. We both had experiences which, looking back on it, we would like to have improved. And I think from that perspective, our passion really was for identifying how could we make a difference and to improve the situation. And I think that shared interest has definitely driven a lot of what we've been doing. So essentially, the nexus and what has brought us together is kind of the impact on mental health and our interest in trying to put in place early intervention strategies, for example, to be able to counter some of these problems. So we then set about trying to get into, I suppose, this area of research. We started off with a very small funded project. So we had £750. We applied for this through the Lincoln Higher Education Research Institute, which essentially it offers a number of small funds throughout the year, or kind of on an annual basis. We applied and we were very fortunate to be successful. This gives us an opportunity then to run a study, and we're going to actually give you some of the findings for this. But this study, we had an opportunity then to present some of our preliminary findings at the International Conference of Mental Health and Wellbeing in PGRs, which is the first kind last year. And we currently have a manuscript under review as well. So I think our message would be that, you know, you don't need to start with a big project. We started very small, and we've been able to hopefully showcase some of the findings, and I hope that you think that they are impactful. To give a bit of context, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, you might be in the space of PGR, mental health and wellbeing research. But I guess in recent years, the last year or two, and even with the most recent SMaRteN and Vitae survey, there's clear evidence of the attention that has been given to PGR, mental health, and doctoral candidates, doctoral students, and so on. And we know some of the key studies in the area have identified that compared to the general population, compared to the undergraduate student, doctoral students tend to be at an increased risk of experiencing psychological distress or having concerns with their mental health. And, you know, if we look at some of the findings, for example, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Levesque et al. Paper, which established that compared to the general population, PGRs or doctoral students were more than twice as likely to have a psychiatric or at risk of a psychiatric disorder. And such findings have kind of grown, and there's increased attention, increased prominence, I suppose, in the media and across the higher education sector, the potential concerns around mental health in this sector. And if we broaden that out, what are the potential implications? So we know that reduced mental health can have some effects in terms of attrition. So people are more likely to withdraw from their studies. Also, the completion times, okay, so we'll impact that. And also, if we look at people's long-term employment opportunities or the likelihood of being employed can actually be impacted by their mental health during their PhD. But often, and I think often as the case can be in academia, that there is a reluctancy on the part of a lot of PhD students, PhD researchers to actually seek help. And that can often be an issue because, you know, a lot of students might feel that they should be able to do this and that sense that they should be able to cope. And if we look at that, there is kind of suggestions potentially of some underreporting across the sector in relation to some of these concerns too. And why is it important? So it, you know, beyond the fact that PhD and doctoral students are obviously incredibly important from the perspective of supporting them, we want to ensure that they're in prime mental health. But PGRs and doctoral students have a really integral role in our society. They are at the cutting edge of new knowledge. They are at the cutting edge of being able to have an impact on society. And if we're not looking after this population, if we're not looking after this group, we, you know, run the risk of being in a scenario where, you know, a lot of global issues, a lot of factors in society, we could be improving much more effectively if we look after this cohort better. And I think that's one thing that really drives our interest, is that, yes, we have the moral obligation to that, but also we need to really support these students to be able to flourish and to grow in doing that. So that's kind of a bit of a background to this work. We've identified that there are some concerns around mental health in this population. And from there, Kelly, I'm just going to hand over to you to address the next part.
Okay. So this is, I'm going to give you an overview now of the first piece of empirical work that we did in this area, which was looking at, sorry, I'm getting feedback. Was looking at how psychological well-being changes, or what the sort of pattern in terms of psychological well-being over the course of the PhD journey looks like. So we set out with 3 research questions. We were interested to find out how doctoral students described their psychological well-being over the course of PhD studies, and if changes did occur. There was a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence and talk about this kind of emotional roller coaster, and we wanted to see whether we could find the data that actually supported that. We were interested to look at factors that potentially impaired or reduced psychological well-being and what they were, and also factors that would potentially improve or sort of provide a buffer against reduced psychological well-being in doctoral students. In terms of method, we obviously had a limited budget, so we kept this first study quite small, and we focused on PhD students who had graduated from the University of Lincoln. We chose to work with graduates because obviously they have completed the journey. A lot of the existing research looks at students who are still active within their studies, which is very valuable, but we wanted to talk to people who had gone right through the process so that they could reflect back on the entire experience. So after we'd been through ethical clearance at the university, we put out a call for participants via Twitter and using posters at the university. Because of GDPR restrictions, which had just come in when we started to recruit for this study, we weren't able to directly contact anybody at the institution who we knew had recently completed their PhD. So we had to wait for people to come to us, essentially. And the key inclusion criteria was that we were interested in talking to people who had confirmation of doctoral award within 2 years of the point that data collection was starting at Lincoln. We had 9 participants in total, 4 male and 5 female with a mean age of 36 years. 5 of those were full-time students and 4 of them were part-time students. So even though we had to recruit in a very kind of open way, we ended up with quite a nicely balanced sample in terms of gender split and the difference between full and part-time students. The mean length of time since completion was 14 months. So the experience still fresh in the mind, but people had had a little bit of time to reflect on it too. In terms of collecting the data, we used a 2-stage method. So this first part is what we've referred to as an adapted life grid. Life grids are a technique that come from public health and epidemiological research, and they are used to help people dig back over a period of time to recall things that have happened to them. So they may be used with somebody who has been given a diagnosis of disease that's quite rare, and you would go back through their entire life history to try and establish what the risk factors for that might have been. Or it can be something very recent. So if you're investigating an outbreak of food poisoning, for example, you would want to track exactly where a person had been in the last 24, 48 hours. So a very flexible, adaptable method and very visual, and we're going to show you what it looks like in a moment. We use those life grid, we'll use the life grid method in combination with semi-structured interviews. So once we'd established patterns and key time points for our participants, we then asked them a series of questions to help explore what was going on at different parts in their journey and how that was impacting on them, how they were feeling, what kind of strategies they had in place to cope with various things at that point. Because of what Trish explained at the beginning about the fact that we'd both had experiences during our own PhDs that had impacted on our mental health, we felt it was very important before we started collecting the data to go through this piloting and bracketing stage. So we used this to both test out the research instruments and make sure that they were working exactly as we wished them to. But we also used it as an opportunity to tell each other our stories. And that enabled us to learn more about each other, but it also enabled us to kind of surface our own experiences so that we were both conscious of those as we moved through the study. Data analysis was conducted in 2 phases as well. So initially we looked at the life grid patterns that the participants had created. And you'll see in a moment that was a very visual process initially, looking at both the changes within our individual participants, but also drawing some comparisons and comparing the different journeys that they'd experienced in terms of the ebb and flow of the PhD. And then to help us understand that, help us explain that, we used the interview data. We conducted a thematic analysis of the interview data to try and pick out what was happening at different phases of the journey and what the common experiences of the group were. Okay, so these next 4 slides are just going to show you what the life grid looked like. So it's split into different components. The first aspect that we asked participants to enter onto the grid. So this was presented to them in the interview situation as an A3 piece of paper with the life grid drawn out on it, but completely blank at this stage. So the first thing we get them to do is to add their key milestone dates in terms of their enrolment, graduation, and then other significant points in between. So it might be things like where their transfer viva from MPhil to PhD happened. They could put date at which they started collecting data, anything that's significant to them. They are completely in control at this stage. Then onto that, we map the key events, phases and challenges in the PhD journey. So now we're getting into more detail about things like applying for ethics, recruiting participants to studies, data collection, data analysis, any of the key sort of phases of the research journey. And then in addition to that, reflecting on anything that happened to them personally while they were studying for their PhDs. And all kinds of things came up here around financial problems that they'd encountered, personal illness, illness of family members, bereavement, pregnancies, you name it. It all seems to happen during the PhD experience. And again, we asked them to map those in so that we could see where in the course of the journey those things were occurring. And then finally, and probably the bit that we were kind of most interested in, we got them to self-rate their psychological well-being during their PhD studies. And we asked them to do this simply by drawing a line onto the life grid to show where they felt their psychological well-being was high, where they felt it was low, with that midpoint of being, this is kind of me at my baseline, my kind of normal, and then indicating where things were good and where things were bad. And what you'll see on the next slide is what they drew for us. So this is the data from all 9 of our research participants. And Trish very cleverly transferred all of the line drawings into a software package, which then created these graphs for us. And you'll see, we think it's a really powerful way to present the data. It very clearly shows that there are some striking differences between the experience that our participants had, but there are also some very striking similarities. I think one thing that is very clear straight away is that this is a process that does have significant impact on people's psychological well-being. And you'll notice in all of those patterns that there are highs and lows in terms of the experience. Some of those may be more pronounced than others, but some of that, again, I think is a reflection of the different types of characters and the differences between the individuals who participated in the story, in the research, but very unique, individual, rich stories that all came together through this research. So this data now is coming more from the thematic analysis of the interviews, and this was what we used to help us understand what was happening in those patterns. And first up, we've got indication of factors that were linked to impaired psychological well-being or feeling less than positive about the PhD experience. And some of the things that seem to impact on our participants were where they experienced setbacks and delays. So when things went wrong with ethics was a common one, where they were struggling to recruit participants. Procedural things, if paperwork got held up in the system or anything like that, that was an annoyance as well. And all of those things impacted on well-being. Feeling under pressure So we saw a sharp drop in psychological well-being when people were building towards particular deadlines, not surprisingly. Supervision problems, again, something that's been explored a lot in the literature around the relationship between doctoral students and doctoral supervisors, and where that relationship's not working, or where that supervisor becomes absent, or that supervisor leaves an institution, can create real stresses for a PhD student. Personal and external issues, as I mentioned, personal illness, family illness, maternity breaks, anything outside of the PhD that was impacting on their ability to focus on and concentrate on the work they were trying to do. Work-study imbalance. So again, we noticed a pattern where the participants were telling us that when the pressures of the PhD became such that it was impacting on their ability to separate out their work and their study, or to even just take breaks from the PhD without feeling immensely guilty about it, that's when we saw that psychological well-being was affected. And again, common theme within the literature, but very strong indications around isolation, and where participants felt that they were operating very much in a vacuum, that it was just them that was feeling this way, that they had no sense of what other people were doing or how other people dealt with particular kinds of problems. That again was having a negative impact on their psychological well-being. On the flip side, and what makes this research different to a lot of what we've seen in the field already, is we were keen to not just look at this from a negative perspective. We wanted to also find out more about actually what's good, what helps, and how can we then make use of that to develop things further. And Trish will talk to you about that in a moment. But these are some of the things that seem to have a really positive impact. And there was a lot of comments around how the small successes and the rewards that you get from the journey were really important in terms of boosting your psychological well-being. And some of that seemed to stem from external feedback from others. So where they got positive feedback from their supervisors, where they'd attended conferences and they got positive feedback on their work, where they'd hit transition period, whether that was confirmation of studies, which is a process we have at Lincoln, or the transfer point from MPhil to PhD, where somebody else was validating that what they were doing was actually going well. That seemed to have a really positive impact in terms of well-being. Personally feeling like they were making progress. So when they have those kind of light bulb moments and something makes sense all of a sudden, it falls into place and they feel like they're actually moving forwards with their work. And both of those, that kind of external feedback and that sense of internally, I feel like I'm getting somewhere with it, seems to boost their confidence. So when things are moving in the right direction, confidence increases, and that seemed to have quite a strong link with increases in well-being in our sample. Good supervision and good relationships with supervisors who were available to them, who provided feedback very promptly, were associated with good well-being, as was having a really good external support network. And people talked about this in different ways. They talked about family members, they talked about other PhD students, they talked about wider friends who were not necessarily involved in the PhD process, but were there to support them and sort of provide them with other things to do. They talked about engaging with things like sports teams and how that provided an outlet for them. And that was all very beneficial in terms of their well-being, and this sense as well of getting the right balance. So where things were operating in a way that allowed them to maintain a balance between PhD and the rest of their lives, that notion of self-management and being aware of when they were feeling stressed and how to deal with that also had a positive impact on their well-being. altogether, we have built very clear evidence from this sample that there are obvious and clear changes in psychological well-being throughout the doctoral journey. And we feel now that it's really important that we use this information that we've got, both in terms of what the negative factors are and the positive ones, to try and develop strategies that can help us to prevent psychological well-being dipping in the way that it does for future PhD students who are coming into the process. And a lot of what we drew out of the study gave us this sense that there was important work that could be done in terms of the transition into doctoral study, and that being a real opportunity for early intervention with PhD students. And I'm going to hand you back to Patricia. Trish, you're muted still.
Okay, so based on some of that work, we had the idea of applying for the SMaRteN fund, which is around non-clinical interventions to improve student mental health. And for us, kind of the impetus was around this idea that early intervention was really key if we look at a doctoral student group. You know, it's not just about remediating deficits, the kind of traditional medical model. It's about actually how can we enable and equip doctoral students to be able to manage the challenges that we've identified and then across the research in this area has identified. So this is what we came up with, this idea of getting off to a mentally healthy start in the doctoral journey. And in terms of where we're coming from with this, if we look at the start of the doctoral journey and kind of the approach that's generally taken in a lot of institutions, what we tend to find is that a lot of induction models tend to be very much institutionally led, and a lot of our participants spoke about they were very regulations focused. So you're going to have, you know, these checkpoints in your journey, these are the processes and the procedures you'll need to follow. You will have X amount of progress meetings with your supervisor, so on and so forth. Obviously, you know, lots of other developmental opportunities that exist, and you're made aware of those. But generally speaking, quite an information intensive type of process. And our data and our research suggested that we really needed to move away from not just kind of this information sharing process, and actually look at the doctoral student group as a community, as forging connections between people. Because I suppose if we look at an undergraduate cohort or a traditional taught postgraduate degree, for example, we have a group, there's a sense of we-ness, there's a sense of us, we know who we are, we have an identity. Whereas often for the doctoral student, what we were tending to find, if we look at that idea of isolation and that sense that, you know, you are an independent researcher, and kind of creating that sense of community or connections can often be challenging. But we know that if we can create that sense of belonging, it can really have positive implications for mental health in the early stages of doctoral study. So what we wanted to really use was kind of draw on some of our data, draw on the literature, and seek to develop some evidence to be able to move towards an induction package that would essentially help PhD students in terms of their mental health and well-being on their journey. So what we're hoping to do with this SMaRteN funded project is essentially to gather together an evidence base whereby it will put us in a position to develop, deliver, and evaluate a student-generated induction package. So from that perspective, what we're really interested in is this is going to be a package that we want to be designed by students for students, or by researchers for researchers. You know, rather than having this institutionally led focus, we want to hear from the postgraduate researchers, from the doctoral students, what would actually help them, what would they like to see in those early stages, and also drawing on some theoretical perspectives related to the social identity approach as well. So essentially, I suppose a couple of the big research questions we're looking to address through this work will be, what does a student-generated induction package look like? What would it involve? What would it entail? To meet the transitional needs, that's a really key focus of what we want to learn more about, is what are those transitional needs? a lot of students come into doctoral study from different backgrounds, different experiences and research. Maybe they've, had some life changes in order to be able to get into that position. What are their unique needs? And I think that's really important to establish. And also, what would the package look like to be able to help them get off that mentally healthy start? And then our second question, I suppose, is more around the process in terms of how will we go about delivering. And I guess in the area of COVID-19 and how we're now currently working, it's thinking, I suppose, more creatively and innovatively about how we would actually deliver something like this, and ultimately, in the long run, how we will evaluate it. So in terms of the project and what it's going to consist of, so there are essentially kind of three key components or three strands to this work in order for us to be able to reach our aim in this sense. So the first component is that we're going to look back on our data from our initial study and really focus in on that early stage, that transition, that first year of doctoral study. The fact that we have a bit of an insight into that, but we just like to really drill down to some of the insights our participants shared with us. The second thing, and something we're getting off the ground imminently, is a systematic review to actually look at, well, what does the evidence tell us about transition? What does the evidence tell us about the early stage of doctoral study in terms of people's experiences of this in relation to mental health and psychological well-being? That's something that, as I said, we're going to start to develop in the coming months. And then this was our empirical piece of work. What we're going to try to establish is move towards understanding what gene generation induction package to promote mental health in doctoral students would look like. So this will involve a co-production where we work in collaboration with key stakeholders, primarily obviously our doctoral researchers, but also looking at key stakeholders in the delivery of mental health provision or support more generally for doctoral students. So that could be, ranging from the equivalent of a doctoral school or a graduate school that you may have, to those in student well-being, to those who might be in charge of postgraduate research at a school, college level, so on and so forth, to really try and create this understanding of how we would actually put into place an induction package, what that would look like, what would the challenges be, and ultimately combining this evidence, this empirical work with our systematic review, we would then try to put us in a position to be able to know what the package would look like and some ideas as to how we might move that forward, which would represent the next real step post SMaRteN project. So that just gives you a bit of a flavour of, I suppose, the different arms to our project and how we envisage it will run over the 12-month period, which will be starting in November of this year. So again, just to thank you for listening. I hope that's given you, I suppose, a flavour of our journey, the research that kind of started us on this journey and how we've actually got to this point. And I suppose the importance of those little steps that we've taken along the way to be able to get here. And we'd love to answer any questions that you may have. If you want to follow up with us after today, our contact details are there, and we're more than happy to chat all about this. We're really passionate about this area and making a difference, so we'd love to hear from you.